You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
To hear more episodes, read about the issues discussed, or to join the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. On today's episode, we're going to be having a conversation with Roel van der Pol, a Belgian Marxist, about a debate he's been having online with the self-described Marxist economist Paul Cockshott over what Marx's theory of value actually is and is not. Before we jump into that conversation, as we do in every episode of the podcast, we're going to take a few minutes to discuss some current events. And this podcast will be talking about the movement to transform policing in America. In today's current events section, we're going to be talking about calls to defund or abolish the police. In our last current events section, one of the things we discussed was this iconic image of the police precinct burning in Minneapolis that sort of sparked the wave of early protests against police brutality across the world. And another iconic image that happened not long after that was the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, being booed out of a rally because he refused to commit to abolishing the police department in Minneapolis. And, you know, if it had just been one or two really radical people or parts of the movement that were calling for this, that would be one thing. But it was very striking to see this entire crowd of people chanting, "Jacob, go home." It seems like the whole movement is behind these kind of demands, which is really new and different in American politics.
Right, and he was pretty far to the left of the Democratic Party in terms of this issue. I mean, you know, he was not like Bill de Blasio or Lori Lightfoot. You know, he tried not to like, you know, stop the protests and anything like that.
Yeah, he was there at the protest with the Black Lives Matter face mask on.
Yeah.
And still they were like, look, are you going to defund the police? And if you're not, we're going to vote you out of office next year.
Right.
And they booed him out of the thing. It's amazing.
Yeah, things have moved a whole lot. And if I'm not mistaken, the city council has a veto-proof majority. And they passed something to reimagine the police, basically get rid of it and start all over. So, yeah, so the support, as you were saying, is really widespread. It's not just a few, you know, extremists, so to speak. People realize that it's not like a few bad apples, it's the entire orchard. You know, and you got to raise the entire orchard and start over.
So we want to talk about this question today. Can you change policing in America, a deeply racist capitalist society? Can you really effectively change policing in a meaningful way? Already we're seeing a quick attempt by both political parties to pacify the protest movement with all sorts of superficial changes, sensitivity training, more sort of top-down supervision, new regulations about what sort of lethal force police can use. But it's all pretty superficial, and the movement seems to be pushing way beyond those sort of demands.
Right. This is the real problem as I see it. The police violence is not, you know, a bug, it's a feature. A lot of people have been saying this. I'm surprised to see so much in the mainstream media about this. But people are saying, look, you know, it is the job of the cops. It has been designed or even created. I'm not sure about the creation part, but it's part of the design of what the police do is to terrorize and keep down oppressed communities, especially, you know, the black community. That's inherent in their job. So I think this is a case where the more radical calls are more realistic than the ones that seem less extreme, which try to straddle, you know, like let's make the cops be good, you know. It's kind of like let's make capitalism, you know, work for the interest of the working class. Those things like are just weird.
So by more radical calls, more radical demands, you mean like people saying that the police need to handle a much smaller amount of things, and we could farm out a lot of things that police are called for to other sorts of social services?
Well, I think that that's probably part of it. The bigger problem is, how do you keep poor people, people who are beaten down systematically by racism, how do you keep them down? How do you keep them from arbitrary terror? Works. That's what they found, is that you can just, pick up anybody, harass them, make them afraid for their life at any time, and that keeps people down. So I don't know that they have another way to do it. It would be much harder. But so I think it's, you can take all kinds of social services and cordon them off and put in social workers and put in all kinds of things to deal with those problems. But the key problem from the standpoint of the ruling class is, how do you keep the population down? So it really is a question of those police powers. Are those police powers going to be broken? And so even so-called defunding, which is not really defunding in most cases, it's cutting the budget, not eliminating it. Even most of these proposals don't go to that issue, whereas some people under the same rubric of defunding are talking about reimagining the police, just getting rid of it and restructuring public safety. That sounds very good. I mean, is it feasible without a thoroughgoing social revolution? The hard part is, from the ruling class standpoint, yeah, you have to oppress the people who are most likely to rebel, especially when they're winning victory after victory right now.
Yeah, I think that is a important question to have in mind, that basic question of the function of the police in a racist and capitalist society, and maintaining class hierarchies and racial hierarchies. The other thing that's just sort of like the institutional power of police departments and police unions in the politics of cities. This sort of insurmountable barrier to police reform has been something that I didn't ever really think that we would see threatened at all. But all of a sudden, within the course of a few weeks, it now looks like this house of cards that can be, now is under threat by social movements, and much fewer people actually support the police than we thought. There seems to be a real opening for smashing or changing or breaking some of that institutional power that policing has in this country.
Yeah. This has been very surprising, and it's because it's so sudden, and it reaches so deeply within the white population. I don't think anybody knew, how deeply it would reach within the white population. I was listening to a 538 podcast very recently, and Claire Malone just said, "Well, it's like a lot of Americans just don't like cops." Right? And that seemed to me to summarize a good deal of it. Yeah, because there is such a mass support for Black Lives Matter, stopping police violence, and so forth. That's given, I think, a lot of politicians cover that they did not have before. That they could, say to the police unions, "No, I'm not going to do everything you want." There were, like in New York, classic case. You have a social democratic, so supposedly very progressive mayor, de Blasio, and he came in, with all kinds of talk to reform the police, and he became just cowed by them. His career as a politician has rested on not pissing off the police too much. And the only thing that can stop that from the standpoint of his career is if he's put in a position, well, his career depends on not being an apologist and a lackey for the police union.
So while there is this function that the police serve in maintaining terror and oppression against oppressed peoples in our country, the question of what sort of reforms or radical demands can be put into action really hinges upon whether this institutional power that the police have over politics and cities and localities can be broken. I mean, this is sort of like a contingent question about the four balances of power in various places, right?
Right. I mean, it's conceivable that we're going to get a resurgence of the KKK and so forth, as we've been getting. If the movement against the police brutality is even more successful, you might have widespread changes, but that drive to keep the population in fear, to terrorize it, that's not going to go away. I mean, I wouldn't want to say it's impossible to radically restructure what official law enforcement is in this country, and there's all kinds of other situations too where you basically have a situation where there's just a continual fight going on between the people who want the police to have power and people who are limiting their power and revolting, whenever there's a unjustifiable homicide or whatever they call it. I mean, we're already seeing basically real-time reactions that are getting somewhere. To Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta and so forth. I mean, people are holding the cops' feet to the fire now. This could continue, and it creates a very unstable situation. But I don't think that cutting police budgets or like sensitivity training and body cams and police a database where you see who's been thrown out of the force for undue force, a ban on chokeholds. These things are just window dressing. They're not going to do anything. I mean, what will do something is if you begin to get convictions of cops for killing people and so forth. But that takes getting rid of this so-called qualified immunity, which makes them almost untouchable. And it requires either a change in suburban white juries, not getting the venue changed in a lot of these cases where they kill somebody in the urban area and then they get the venue changed to people defending the cops. They get the venue changed to some suburban rural area with all these white people who just want the cops to do their dirty work for them, and they do it and they let them off the hook. That happens in an inordinate number of cases. So short of like a real solution to any problem, there probably can be stuff done to keep the police from just engaging in wanton terror all the time as just standard practice. They can be, made to look over their shoulder and think twice. That kind of pressure can be put. But so I don't want to say that there's a structural problem or the function of the cops to keep people down that precludes any positive change here. I don't want to say that. It's not what I think. It's just you have to think of what can be done, I guess, short of like solving a problem, right? That's the difference. Is that within capitalism, especially U.S. capitalism, which is just drenched, wherein the race issue and the class issue are one issue, and they've always been one issue. In a situation like that, you're not going to solve the problem of police violence within the capitalist system. But there are things that can be done to weaken the absolute power that the cops have been displaying for decades now.
Well, I'm sure we could talk about this topic all day, but we do need to get onto our main segment, which is our conversation with Belgian Marxist Roel van der Pol about his debate with Paul Cockshott about Marx's theory of value. So, Roel, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast today.
So glad you're having me.
So we invited you on the podcast today to talk about this debate you've been having with Paul Cockshott, the so-called Marxist-Humanist, about the labor theory of value. And I've read the debate, I've read your contributions, I think they're fantastic, but I don't know much about you. So can you tell me and other people, who you are, where you're from?
Yeah, so I'm a political activist from Belgium. I'm affiliated with the Workers' Party of Belgium, which is a Marxist political party. I'm working for the parliamentary group of the Workers' Party, and I'm also involved with the educational department, in which I mostly study the courses on political economy.
How did you and Andrew connect with each other?
So ever since a few years ago, when I wrote an email to him about his work on reclaiming Marxist capital, we've been corresponding back and forth on a series of issues. And so now, when I wrote this article responding to Cockshott, I asked Andrew's opinion. Because, well, most of the stuff in there draws heavily on Andrew's work. And so, yeah, he invited me to the podcast.
Yeah, I thought it was a very impressive piece of work.
Thanks.
Yeah, I thought you really put the argument together well and supported it really well with all this documentation of quotes from Capital.
Thanks a lot.
So let's get into it here. Your article is called Paul's Theory and Marx's Theory of Value, a Response. And Paul refers to Paul Cockshott. In case listeners don't know who Paul Cockshott is, can you tell them who he is?
Yeah, so Cockshott is a computer scientist. He's also a Marxist publicist from Scotland. So he's known primarily in the leftist movement for his work on socialist economic planning. So I think somewhere in the early 90s, he wrote a book called Towards a New Socialism, together with a guy named Alan Cottrell, who was an economist. I think it's an excellent book, by the way. At least I think everyone should read it. I think it's by far the most interesting stuff you can read about economic planning, even though it's far from perfect. But apart from this work on economic planning, Cockshott also writes a lot of stuff about value theory, about Marxist value theory. And the role value plays in economics, and that's where I think he gets a lot of stuff wrong, but specifically that he gets Marx really wrong.
When I think of Paul Cockshott, I think of this singular obsession he has in showing that there's empirical proof for the labor theory of value. It's an idea that I think probably has some appeal to people at first, but as hopefully we'll demonstrate here in this podcast, there are a lot of problems with this notion, actually. So let's jump right into it. The article is about the so-called labor theory of value, and you argue there that there are at least two contrasting theories here. There's Marxist theory and there's Cockshott's theory. How do they differ?
Yeah, so first of all, Cockshott claimed that his theory and Marx's theory are in fact the same thing, or even that there's only one labor theory of value, the labor theory of value. And I think that's kind of the problem. So now, for Marx, his theory of value says that the value of a commodity is determined by the average labor time currently needed to reproduce the commodity. So yeah, that's the definition. His definition is right there in the first chapter of Volume 1 of Capital, which he does call the chapter on the theory of value in his introduction. So that's Marx's value theory. It's really, I think, as simple as that. Of course, his theory of capitalism as a whole goes into a lot of other stuff, but I think that's about it as far as value is concerned. Now, Cockshott says kind of the same thing, so that the value of a commodity is determined by the average labor time needed to produce it, but he adds something else to this. So he adds that according to the labor theory of value, each commodity exchanges with other commodities in proportion to that value. So that commodities prices are proportional to value. So for example, if it takes 2 hours to bake a bread and 4 hours to build a table, leaving aside the price of inputs, the average price of the tables would be the double of the price of bread. So I think that's just not Marx's theory, just simply not there in his work.
Yeah, I mean, it actually was historically a theory that Adam Smith suggested may have held true at a very, very primitive state of economic development, that early and rude state of society. But, you know, Adam Smith didn't think it held true in capitalism. David Ricardo didn't think it held true. Karl Marx didn't think it held true. The only people who think it holds true are, I don't think they even think it holds true. I don't think there's anybody who think it holds true.
Yeah, and like Marx also says, or was it Engels in an addendum or an introduction to Volume 3, that in fact before capitalism, when there was simple commodity production, this might have been true, but as soon as you have capital, it's just
right.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, so Roel, why do you think this is an important issue? I mean, we're talking not just to economists here or, you know, specialists in value theory. We're involved with the general public. Your work is, you know, political for the general public. Why do you think the issue is important? And indeed, you know, you wrote a whole major article, in my view, about this. Why? What motivated you to write that article? What's the overriding importance of this issue?
Yeah, so well, there's several things there. So what motivated me? Well, to begin with, Cockshott asked me to. So he offered to put it up on his blog as a guest post. So that's kind of a generous offer I couldn't refuse. But apart from that, well, I was arguing against Cockshott's position in the comment section of his Facebook page. And then suddenly he published an article in which he claims that I say that Marx didn't have a labor theory of value at all. So yeah, I never claimed that, and I didn't like that. So I decided to put up my arguments in a more systematic form, and so that's where the article came out. Now that's what motivated me. So why is this important? Well, I think first of all, it's just important for science as such. So if you have two scientists who have completely different theories with completely different predictions about reality, it's just nonsense to pretend that they're saying the same thing. So it doesn't advance anybody. It doesn't bring anything positive to neither political movement, neither scientific understanding. You just get no results with this kind of attitude. So I think that's the scientific part. I think on the political side, I don't really go into that in my article, but I think Cockshott's theory of value also has serious implications in how a socialist society can regulate production. So I think Cockshott, Marx would have said he's a value fetishist. So Marx talks about commodity fetishism, which is actually the same thing. So he has this idea that value is an eternal thing that has a huge impact on every kind of society. And I think that just maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but at least it's not what Marx thinks. And I think politically it leads to seriously wrong ideas about, first of all, how capitalism functions. And how we can combat capitalism, and second of all, on how we can build socialism.
So one of Cockshott's main preoccupations is to defend the labor theory of value, as he refers to it. But since, as you point out in the article, his theory isn't really Marxist theory, which of these theories is he defending, or does his defense of the labor theory of value perhaps serve to defend both of them at the same time?
Yeah, so as I said, Marx and Cockshott both say that the value of a commodity is determined by labor time, but Cockshott adds that commodities' average prices are proportionate to that value, so that's contrary to Marx. Now, I think Cockshott honestly believes, at least that's what he says, so who am I to deny this, that Marx's theory about capitalism as a whole remains intact if you interpret his value theory the way Cockshott does. So I think he also deduces from that if he can prove that empirically prove that the value theory is correct, he thinks he proves Marx. But the way in which he proves value theory is just not Marx's theory. So I think he's wrong about that. I think he's wrong about the role value theory plays in Marx's theory. So yeah, I think he doesn't actually defend them at the same time, even if he thinks so. So he kind of thinks that he's saving the essence of Marx's theory. But I don't think that's what he's doing.
Right. I mean, he's actually extremely critical of Marx. I've written about his stuff, and he says, Marx was just wrong, that the deviations of commodities prices from the commodities values, is an important issue. He just says Marx was wrong about that. And that's not a minor theme to Marx.
That's the strange thing, I think, in debating with Cockshott is so he's presenting his theory as if he's defending Marx. But at other places, he openly criticizes Marx. He says, yeah, Marx is wrong about this and that, and I think we should correct him this and that way. So when he's writing to a scientific audience, he seems to be open about the fact that what he's saying is not what Marx is saying. But as soon as you go onto his blog, onto his Facebook page, actually he's claiming that what he says is what Marx said. And that's just not true.
So you write about that in your piece. You talk about how Cockshott seems to be determined to force Marx into being a supporter of Cockshott's theory of value. How does he do that? What's his approach?
Yeah, so by force, I actually mean he goes on interpreting. So he builds up an interpretation of Marx, I think in a very, very strange way, to make it seem that Marx says what he says he said. So I'm gonna give a couple of examples. So, for example, in volume 3 of Capital, Marx says, and everybody acknowledges this, that in fact commodities don't exchange at their values, that they tend to exchange at prices of production, which equalize the rate of profit, so that's not values. And so he introduces sort of a rupture between volume 3 of Capital and volume 1 and 2. So he says, yeah, in volume 1 and 2 of Capital, Marx had a very simple theory of value that says that commodities exchange at their values, that prices are equal to average prices are equal to values. And for some reason he dropped this in volume 3, but he shouldn't have, and he should have stuck to what he wrote in volume 1 and 2. So that's actually, he makes Marx contradict himself between volume 3 and 1 and 2, and he says, well, we drop the 1 and we keep the other 2. So that's one thing. I think it's not really a sound interpretative strategy, but I think a bigger problem for him even still is that even in volume 1 of Capital, Marx says at least 3 different instances that in reality average prices are not equal to values. So I think there's a footnote at the end of chapter 5. There's another one in chapter 9. There's also a place where he says that industries that produce a lot of surplus value don't reap a lot of profit. So his response to these passages in volume 1 is saying that Marx was just being dishonest. So he actually literally said this in one of his responses on Facebook at one of my comments. So that's the second thing. So he has the rupture with volume 3 of Capital. He has the contradiction or the dishonesty of Marx in volume 1. Then there's a letter of Marx to Engels in 1865, I think. 2 years before volume 1 of Capital was published. Marx writes, I've solved all the theoretical problems in the first 3 books. And so, this means that for Marx, this was one theory. There was no distinction between volume 3 and volume 1 of Capital. He held the same theory throughout his 3 books. So it's just completely in contradiction with what Cockshott claims Marx said. So by force, just to come back to the question, I mean he construes an interpretation in which he makes Marx say things that contradict himself, that make him dishonest, that make no sense if you read other material by Marx. So just a really, really bad interpretative strategy. But it does some other stuff. So it takes passages from Marx, where Marx very remotely touches on the subject of the relation between value and price. And then he inflates these passages as though they confirm Cockshott's theory. So one example, there is a passage in chapter 9 or 10 of Capital Volume 3, where Marx says that changes in values of commodities dominate changes in prices. I think it's chapter 9. Then Cockshott says that, if changes in values are the only thing that determine changes in prices, then the two are necessarily proportioned to each other. But that's just not the same thing. So to dominate doesn't mean that it's the only thing that determines. So Marx nowhere says that changes in values are the only thing that determine prices. He also talks about the equalization of the rate of profit through competition, supply and demand, the movement of capital between industries, so on and so forth. The strange thing about this specific example is that precisely in the chapter where Marx says this is the chapter where he develops his theory of prices of production, which says that average prices are not equal to value. So as far as interpretative strategies go, I think that's the worst you can go.
Yeah, it's like the textbook definition of cherry picking.
Yeah, exactly.
So Roel, you've been emphasizing that the way that Cockshott argues what he's doing purports to be a defense of the labor theory of value, but it turns out to be an attack on Marx. He says Marx contradicted himself. He accuses Marx of being dishonest, and the whole way he presents Marx seems like Marx was just some guy flailing around, not knowing what he was doing. But I want to leave aside, the fact that some people might not like that he's attacking Marx. That's a subjective consideration, whether you like Marx, whether you like Marx being attacked. The question is, with regard to Cockshott's argumentative strategies, apart from those subjective considerations of whether we like what he's doing or not, is there anything wrong objectively with the way that Cockshott is arguing here?
I think so, yes. So, Cockshott, he's not the first guy who was trying to interpret an author. So there's a lot of people, a lot of smart people who developed a lot of strategies to interpret authors, and there's a broad consensus in the scientific field of text interpretation, of exegesis. There's a principle of scientific exegesis that's called the criterion of coherence. This criterion actually, it says that, if you're trying to interpret an author, if you're trying to get what he meant when he was writing what he wrote, it's just not enough to say, that's what he wrote, so that's what he said. People can interpret what a guy wrote in a lot of different ways. You can't just say, no, we should interpret a guy that way because that's what he wrote, because 10 different people will have 10 different interpretations. So this criterion, it says that the way to correctly interpret an author is the way in which he makes sense, is the way in which he's not contradicting himself, is the way in which the things he says are connected, make sense as a whole. For example, for Marx, this is a guy, he was not an idiot. This was a guy with a doctoral thesis in philosophy. He was a guy who studied economics all his life, who was in political discussion with a lot of other guys, who was really thorough. And so, first of all, saying that a guy like this constantly contradicted himself, jumped from one theory to another, was writing one thing in Capital Volume 1, while simultaneously, because Marx wrote his different volumes of Capital almost simultaneously, while simultaneously writing in Volume 3 of Capital the completely contradictory statements, a completely contradictory theory, that just completely implausible. So that goes against all standard scientific practice of how you should interpret an author. That's the criterion of coherence, and I think that's objectively one of the standard scientific methods to interpret an author, and Cockshott is just not doing that. Like Andrew says, he's kind of saying that Marx was just flailing around, that we were just yabbering this and then yabbering that, and saying one thing at one moment and another thing the next day, and then again the first thing and then something else. It's just not a scientific way of interpreting an author.
So why do you think that Cockshott is so determined to interpret Marx in this way that seems so hard to do if you actually read Marx's texts? Is it that he's just a really sciencey guy, and so he assumes that empirical proof is like the pinnacle of theory, and everything else doesn't matter? Or is it about the transformation problem? Is it just an attempt to avoid the transformation problem by saying, prices of production and average prices don't really occur in the real world, so we don't have to worry about the transformation problem?
Yeah, there's a lot of unpack there. So I think there's several things. I want to quote something he wrote in his article, which my article is a response. He writes that the insistence that Marx had a different theory than his theory, than Cockshott's theory, is rather strange. Why would you want to claim that Marx was not a supporter of what we know to be testable and correct scientific theory? So I think that's a really, really odd statement. So he's saying, empirical evidence says this, so Marx said it because then Marx is correct. So it's completely the other way around. So it's like we look at reality, we look at empirical evidence, and if we think the empirical evidence says this, then our favorite author, he must have said it too. So I don't know what was in his mind when he wrote that, but I think it more or less confirms your suggestion, Brandon. So he wrote it in other places. So generally his theory is about avoiding transformation problems. So he's saying, transformation problem is a real problem, or maybe not even that. So maybe it might be a real problem, might be unimportant, might be existing, non-existing, whatever. It's not important because empirically we can prove Marx. But yeah, the problem is empirically that doesn't prove Marx. It proves another theory. It proves Cockshott's theory. So yeah, for the rest, I don't want to go into a trial of intentions. But I think, yeah, obviously there are a lot of more Marxists around there than Cockshottists. So if he can claim that he has the proof proving Marx's theory, he will have a much wider readership than when he's just saying, well, I'm just proving Cockshott's theory. So
Right. And when you said that the empirical evidence confirms Cockshott's theory, that's based on an assumption that I don't think you hold, that Cockshott's empirical evidence is legitimate. We'll talk about that later, but I just wanted to make clear that you weren't saying that the actual empirical evidence actually shows Cockshott's theory to be correct.
No, and I can say a thing or two in a few moments if you like.
Right. But before we do that, here's the issue that has been uppermost in my mind in dealing with people like Cockshott and dealing with all of the rest of these people as well. You say something that I completely agree with in your article. You write, quote, like anyone else, Marx has a right to his own theory. I propose that we let Marx have his and let Paul have his and let both contend so that we can see which one better stands the test of reality. That's what you wrote. And to me, that just seems like sound, scholarly, scientific procedure. It seems incontrovertible. But what does it seem like to Cockshott? Do you think he'll accept your point that Marx is entitled to his own theory, just like Cockshott and everybody else is?
Yeah, well, I seriously doubt that. So he has an attitude like, yeah, well, we should act like scientists. Marx wrote this and that, and the essence of what he wrote is this and that, and I can prove this with my empirical evidence. So leaving aside, because we're going into that in a moment, but leaving aside if it's true or not, he's reducing Marx's theory to what he thinks is the essence of Marx's theory. And there's not a shred of doubt in my mind that when he'll respond, maybe he'll agree that, yeah, well, this is in fact not what Marx wrote. He did contradict himself. He did say this, and yeah, he didn't hold that values and prices are proportionate. But he'll say, there's no doubt in my mind, that yeah, the essence of Marx's theory is in volume 1 of Capital, and this essence remains intact if prices are in fact proportionate to values, contrary to what Marx believed, and it would prove the fundamentals of his theory. And so, yeah, that's actually Cockshott deciding for Marx what's the essence of his theory.
Bingo! You've hit the nail exactly on the head. Okay? This is, I was going to editorialize, but you hit the nail exactly on the head, and this shows that what Cockshott means by science is unthinking empiricism.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, it's not science at all. Okay? In other words, unthinking empiricism means you just accept whatever appears to you, the categories that strike you as reality, and you don't question your categories, you don't justify them. So what appears to Cockshott to be the essence, that is the essence. Why? Well, it doesn't get tested, it doesn't get clarified, it's just this is the essence. Okay, he this is why he has no respect for either Kant or Hegel or anybody, because he does not understand how fundamentally dogmatic it is just to accept the categories that come to you as the true reality of things. Just accept them at face value. If he's going to claim, that this or that is the essence of Marx, he has to have criteria for distinguishing what was essential from what is not. He has to show that those are Marx's own criteria. He hasn't begun to do the work that he needs to do to justify any claim about what's essential.
Yeah, exactly. And so, in fact, the whole point why we got into this debate before he wrote his article against my arguments, before I responded to him, was exactly a debate about Hegel, about dialectics, about the need for dialectics. So, yeah, I think Marx at a certain point, I don't know where he wrote it, and I think it's a very clear language and very true. If appearance would directly coincide with essence, so if the empirical facts as you see them would
directly explain fundamentally how the world works, all science would be superfluous.
I think it's in the Trinity Formula chapter of Volume 3.
Yeah, it's possible. I think it's in Capital, Volume 3, maybe in the Trinity chapter. So that's precisely, I think, that's the reason you have science. Because the things you can see the sun go down. Yeah, but we all know it's not the sun going down, it's the Earth turning around on its axis. So, yeah, if you just accept empirical facts at face value without questioning them, without putting them in a broader whole and building a theory that's testable, of course, against this, yeah, you're not explaining anything, you're just repeating what you're seeing.
Cockshott claims that the empirical evidence, as he calls it, confirms his theory, and he puts a lot of stress on this alleged evidence. But if we assume for the sake of argument that his evidence is legitimate, why do you think he is so concerned to emphasize this evidence and downplay these theoretical issues and these interpretive issues? If we assume for the sake of argument that his evidence is legitimate, does that render debates about theoretical and interpretive issues irrelevant?
Yeah, absolutely not, I think. And I think there's several reasons. I think, first of all, if Cockshott's empirical evidence is legitimate, if it were legitimate, then, yeah, Marx is just simply proven wrong. And then we just acknowledge that. So I think Cockshott claims that his evidence proves that Marx is right, but it does the exact opposite. So I wouldn't think that's a very scientific attitude. As I said before, I think generally regarding science this is wrong. This leads us to wrong political conclusions. So it's not at all irrelevant. So it's also linked to what I said before about Cockshott deciding for Marx what's the essence of his theory. So yeah, if he absolutely wants to prove Marx, his version of Marx, and he thinks he's proving it, and yeah, I think that's not in any way theoretically sound. So no, I don't think it's irrelevant. It's just two different theories. If you prove one, you disprove the other. If you prove the other, you disprove one.
Hey, in just a few moments, we're going to continue this conversation with Roel about Marx's theory of value. But first, a few words from Anja Claard of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors our podcast.
Hello, this is Anja Claard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marx's philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
So we promised we would come to this issue of Cockshott's supposed empirical evidence for the labor theory of value. Of course, as we mentioned before, we don't really need to discuss this in order to make the argument that you've made in your paper that you're making here about his bad interpretation of Marx. But we should get into it, because I'm sure people are curious about what his evidence is and what we should make of it.
I say in my article, I think I just mentioned it in a footnote, that I don't think his evidence is legitimate. I think, Cockshott, it presents a lot of data that show that, in fact, when you compare the total price going around in industries in terms of money, that is very strongly correlated, in fact, with the value in terms of the labor that's used in this industry. So he presents this data, which at face value, in fact, I think it's not like he's making any mathematical errors. I think the correlation is there. Well, there's no question about that. The correlation is there at face value. But the problem is, what we talked about is, it's not because there is data saying something at face value that's all there is to the story. So the problem specifically here is that the data he presents, they can be used to prove what he wants to prove. So there are several problems. I think Andrew has wrote a lot of very convincing stuff about this in a few articles in which he criticized Cockshott. Cockshott answered, but I think his answers are entirely unconvincing. But the major problem of the data that Cockshott uses is that it's highly aggregated government data about industries. So what does that mean? So, for example, a hypothetical example, it's not directly from the data he uses, but let's take the bread industry. So the bread industry, guys breaking bread. So what do you include in this industry? Do you include the wheat industry? Do you agriculture? Do you include the mill industry? Do you just include the baking of the bread itself? So what government data agencies do is they just lump together all different kinds of companies which they think belong to the same industry. And they create a big melting pot of a huge number of companies. And what happens if you do this is that the differences between prices and values, and in fact any difference, is just averaged out. For example, just imagine that baking the bread is very labor intensive. There's a lot of direct human labor going around, while the mill industry is very capital intensive. It's mostly by machines. There's almost no one working there, just a guy who's twisting some buttons. So if you lump these two together in the same industry, of course you average out the difference between values and prices. It's just you just get a mean. You don't get any information at all about the actual correlation between the values and the prices of commodities. So what Cockshott needs to prove his theory, it's not in the aggregated data. What he needs is the disaggregated data, the data on industry level. He has to be able on company level. So he has to be able to compare, for example, a Shell production facility, the prices at which they sell their refined oil, with a random bakery on the corner of the street. He needs the numbers, the data on these two specific companies, but not just the data of the entire petrochemical industry, the data of the entire bread industry, or whatever you call it, industry. It just can be used to prove what he wants it to prove. So he can go on and on and on about the fact that the data shows this and the data shows that, and the data does in fact show that, but the conclusions he gets from this, these are just not the things that you can conclude from the data.
The problem is that when you look at the data, these aggregate industry level figures, the total value of the petrochemical industry, the total price of the output of the petrochemical industry and the baked goods industry, and you say they're highly correlated. That's not what, first of all, people mean by saying values and prices are highly correlated. When people say values and prices are highly correlated, we mean per unit, okay? The value of a loaf of bread, the price of a loaf of bread, the price of a barrel of oil, and the value of a barrel of oil per unit of the commodity. And when you aggregate things, you're going to get very high correlations, because what you're then doing is comparing large industries' values and prices and small industries' values and prices. So as you increase the size of the industry, they're producing more stuff, right? So they're producing more value, they're obtaining a higher price. So basically, all the evidence tells us is that the total value of output and the total price of output are big in big industries, and they're small in small industries. And there's an article I put on my website, a parody of what these people do. I show the same thing. You could supposedly provide knockdown empirical evidence that the major driver of income is Christianity. I call it the Christianity theory of income. You look at states of the United States. I took the actual data. In states with a lot of Christians, the statewide income is very, very high. In states with not many Christians, statewide income is very low. Well, why? In big states, highly populous states, there's a lot of Christians, and so there's also a lot of people and a lot of production. There's high income. In tiny states without a lot of people, you don't have many Christians, you don't have much income. Okay, but when you hear that Christianity is the major determinant of income, what you are really saying is that on a per capita basis, per person, income per person is the main. The percentage of people in the state who are Christian is the main driver of income per person in the state, and that's just not true at all. So I did basically a point-by-point parody, and it's on my website, showing that using their procedures, where you just aggregate everything and you're correlating large this with large that and small this with small that, you could do that with things that are completely cockamamie, as well as what they're doing. You could supposedly prove the main driver of income is Christianity. It's just not true.
Right. So if Cockshott can empirically prove his theory, how does that relate to Marxist theory?
Yeah, very little actually. I think so. For Cockshott, this is the alpha and the omega of proving Marxist theory empirically. So if you can prove this theory that prices are on average, commodity prices are on average proportionate to values, then you vindicate Marx. And if you can prove this empirically, you can prove Marx. Given that that's not Marxist theory, well, the data we should use or should not use to prove or disprove Cockshott's theory, well, they're just not the data we need to prove or disprove Marx's theory. So, both theories don't require the same evidence to be proven. And no, I don't think at all that it's impossible to support or undermine Marxist theory empirically. But I think the way Cockshott is trying to do it, whether he's using the right or the wrong data, but the way he's trying to do it is just not the way you should test Marxist theory.
Right. Okay. So I suspect that people who are sympathetic to Cockshott would say that you don't believe in empirical science and testing theories and so forth, but that's not what you're saying.
No.
Something we quoted earlier. You say, let both Marx's and Cockshott's theories contend, so we can better see which one better stands the test of reality. So you're not rejecting empirical testing of theories, ascertaining which ones better stand the test of reality. You affirm the need for that.
Exactly.
But you're saying that the Cockshott's way of doing this is not acceptable. So the question is, can you suggest other ways to test Cockshott's theory and or Marxist theory?
Yeah, sure. So, I think it is a scientific principle that theory, whatever theory about whatever subject, a scientific theory, it's only a scientific theory if you can make predictions with it and test this predictions, or if you can explain the data with it, and if you can test this against empirical reality. So if you have a theory which is just completely disconnected from anything empirical, it's just words. You can't explain anything with this, just a bunch of words. So scientific theory should be tested empirically. I completely agree with this. But yeah, Cockshott seems to believe, and I think he's not the only one thinking this. I think actually Bauer, who was an Austrian, was a founder of the Austrian School of Economics. He said the same thing about Marx. He says, well, Marx starts out by saying that prices are proportional to values. He's making a logical argument right at the start of Capital. He should have made an empirical argument, and if he had made an empirical argument, he would have seen that he was wrong. So Bauer thought Marx was wrong about prices equaling values. Cockshott thinks that it's exactly what Marx said. So yeah, they say, yeah, your theory is just not falsifiable. So the problem with this is that scientific theories are actually almost never tested by empirically testing their assumptions. They're tested by empirically testing their conclusions, their predictions about reality. So, for example, the theory of Einstein's theory of relativity. One of the implications of this theory, or the ways to interpret this theory, is the assumption that actually there are not 3 dimensions but 4 dimensions. Time is the 4th dimension. Well, you cannot empirically test if time is actually a 4th dimension. What you can test are all the different results that come out of Einstein's theory of general and specific relativity. So the same thing is true for Marx's theory. So his assumption about values being determined by socially necessary labor time, by the average labor time necessary to reproduce a commodity, it's not something you can directly see in reality. Marx says it. Marx says, yeah, if you go look at prices, they won't be proportionate to values. But Marx does go to a whole lot of conclusions about capitalist reality, about capitalist economy, that you can test. And I think I wrote this in my article. I think the problem is that it's a highly controversial subject, but one of the most important conclusions, Marx calls it the most important law of political economics, is the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So when you replace human labor, when you replace workers more and more by machines, when human labor is playing a smaller and smaller role in production, there will be a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. There are a lot of counter tendencies, but you can empirically observe these counter tendencies. So this is a theory that makes prediction about reality. Now, there are a lot of ifs and buts and shoulds, because I won't go into the details, because, for example, the theory doesn't say that the rate of profit should necessarily fall always in the long run. But you can check my article if you want more details about this. I think Andrew's book, The Failure of Capitalist Production, is also great about this. I refer to an article by Andrew and some other guys about Heinrich.
One of those other guys was Brendan Cooney.
Yeah, so Andrew and Brendan and some other guys about Heinrich, who was a Marx scholar, who did say, yeah, Marx predicted that the rate of profit always falls in the long run. Well, that's just not the case. But leaving aside these specifics of the theory, there is a tendency of the rate of profit to fall according to Marx, and this tendency is directly related to his theory of value. So we can look at the data and we can check if this tendency holds in reality. It's not an assumption of Marx's theory, it's his conclusion. But if his conclusion holds, well, then this means that his assumptions were probably correct. So yeah, I think that's one point where Cockshott is, I think is, yeah, just, I don't know really why he says this, because, yeah, as I said, almost all scientific theories are tested by testing their conclusions, not their assumptions. One thing he did say in his article when he argued against me is that, well, yeah, but the neoclassical economics can also explain in a logical, coherent way the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Well, that might be the case or it might not be. I'm not an expert in neoclassical economics, but the point is, yeah, well, if that's the case, then you just add different predictions, look at both theories and just check where they yield different predictions and test those. So, and if two theories, just imagine, if neoclassical theory and Marxist political economic theory yield exactly the same predictions in all circumstances, well, yeah, then they're just one as good as another. But I highly doubt that that's the case. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and this is not something that's obscure. This is something extremely well known. This is basically something that every economist knows, and people learn very early on in their economic training, because what people typically confront in when they start to learn economics is you get a lot of models with a lot of very unrealistic assumptions.
Yeah.
And there's a tendency to criticize the assumptions for lack of realism. And the hardline position is that the assumptions don't matter. It's irrelevant to criticize the assumptions, because the point of a theory is to make predictions. And if a theory on the basis of unrealistic assumptions is able to make, strong and accurate predictions, then it's done its job. So there's nothing to criticize there. There's a debate around these issues, but the basic point that the point is to make predictions or, about past events, so-called retrodictions, and that is the test of the theory. That is basically universally accepted. The only question about unrealistic assumptions is, does the realism of the assumptions help you to make good predictions or not? That's the only real debate. But this whole idea of like proving your assumptions is just it's an artifact of just a failure to understand any scientific practice.
Yeah, precisely. So the whole of modern physics, the whole of quantum mechanics, is built on completely unrealistic assumptions. But given that they yield very accurate predictions, given that a lot of the technology we use today is based on these theories, they work. Yeah, well, they're the best theories we have. So it's not about the assumptions, it's about the predictions and the conclusions.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for the podcast today. Roel, this has been a great interview.
Well, thanks.
And thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
It was a great experience.
That's all the time we have for today's episode of Radio Free Humanity. Please stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org for more episodes. You can leave a comment, you can like the podcast, you can subscribe to it, and please share it far and wide.